says open. Your voices, something's coming up. So while that hopefully comes up,
Yes.
Oh, there it is.
Perfect.
Can we see it now? Is everybody seeing it? Yes, I guess. I'm just looking at Beth. Beth will be my moving her head. Yes. So as I was thinking deeply about this notion of justice, of pedagogy and justice, and in terms of my teaching, I realized that I do actually engage in this notion through my unwavering commitment to help students find what I call their voice and their story. And I call this backyard food histories as acts of justice. That's what I call this presentation. But really, what I would like to share with you, and I'm going to try to go kind of quickly through what I'm saying here, because I would like to have some time to engage in a discussion, and I can elaborate a little bit more on some things that I've done. So I am going to ask Beth to pretend to be my student in multiple years. So I'm going to share some slices of things that I've done to try to encourage my students to find their voice, to embrace their voice, and to claim space with their voice. So journal writing is an integral component of just about all my classes. Either they do it in the old traditional way, in which I actually ask students to bring a journal to class, like a paper, those wonderful paper journals, and a pencil, or we do it digitally, but there's always a journal component to it. So I want to, before I go into the theories and the ideas that have influenced me, or that I have developed, I would like to begin this presentation by having you listen to the voice of one of my students on something that she wrote at the end of the semester when I was teaching a course on women philosophers in the kitchen. And as I said here, this course I taught in 2003, so almost 21 years ago, early on in my career. It was a course for women's studies and literature, women in literature. We read a lot of memoirs and with recipes and so forth, and a lot of theory about food. And this is the reflection that my student did at the end of the semester. Beth, do you mind reading it for us?
I'd be honored. A lot has changed for me this year, that in some way this class has given me the opportunity to put all the pieces together and define my true self. Something that I was aware lived inside of me, yet I had been too busy to appreciate. Each week, we'd touch on a subject that would, in some way, tie into a personal realm that I either hadn't dealt with or had suppressed for other reasons. I learned much about my inner self and became capable of appreciating the individual I am. Thank you for your companionship, for your encouragement, and for sharing yourself.
So I want to begin here framing this because I think it does capture this idea for me anyway. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong doing our question and answer chat later today at the end of this hour. But to me, this captures this notion that when I introduce food studies in literature classes, first of all, at least 20 years ago, it wasn't particularly something the students were aware of. I mean, food studies as a theory, as an argument, in literature, it wasn't really something that most of us studied. It wasn't as pronounced as it is now when I started. So to me, this reflection of my student indicates the value of allowing students to understand the power that food has in their lives and how it does transform them, how food can be used to create transformations in their own lives. And I think that's captured here in this reflection. And this was early on in my career. So how do I get there? Or what were some of the early influences in my own pedagogical processes of understanding that our role as professors is to, at least I feel strongly about this, so that my role as a professor is to help students understand themselves. It's really an internal journey that I'm committed to have students go through that internal process and to recognize that they have so much knowledge. A lot of our students here at the University of Texas at El Paso are first generation students. Many of them are immigrants. But even if you're not first generation, I mean, all of us have we have a life. We have experiences, right? So how do we tap into that source of knowledge and make it integral to the class is what I'm committed to. So three of the people who have been extremely influential, I call it theoretical conceptions tools in my own pedagogical processes, has been Ferret notion of conscientización, which is a process of developing a critical awareness of one's social realities through reflections and actions, where actions become the praxis of changing that reality. So knowledge has to lead to some sort of action. And to me, that's the justice the pedagogy can do. I also have been influenced tremendously, as I assume many of you have perhaps, with Bell Hooks' notions of engaged pedagogies, which she describes as a progressive and holistic education that emphasizes well-being as a process of self-actualization by connecting the will to know with the will to become. So for me, that has always translated to, if we're going to study theoretical arguments about Marxism and feminism and all the crazy things that we do in literary studies, it needs to be connected to their lives somehow so that they can do something with it. And what better way to introduce all these theoretical concepts than food? You know, we all eat, we all are connected to food. We have a relationship with food, whether we are fully aware and critical of it, we still have that relationship. So my classes have been grounded in tapping into that everyday practice and putting into a bigger frame of the multiple relationships that food has. And I've done this also by taking to heart, I should say. If somebody can help me pronounce her last name, I would appreciate it, because I can only say Smith, but I cannot pronounce the other name. Anybody? Beth? You want to take no? Okay, so we just leave it at Smith right now. Sorry for not being able to know how to pronounce it. She wrote this wonderful book called Decolonizing Methodologies that I hope you all read. If not, I highly encourage you to read it. It's a wonderful book. But what I take to heart with her book, it's actually on me, not necessarily on my students. And I take to heart this notion of intellectual humility, in which I need to recognize that just because I read food studies and food theory, and I've written a lot of books and articles about food studies, that I'm not the one who knows this knowledge. That if I'm in the classroom and I'm talking to students about their stories and their food practices, they are the experts, not me. So I need to give them enough space. So this idea of intellectual humility, which is something that I practice in class and introduce my students to, it's really to be aware, be cognizant that there are multiple ways of knowing, that my knowledge is just one, but my students' knowledge is other ones. And that we need to be humble enough to not approach our classrooms or our research with, I'm the academic, I'm the one who has done many years of schooling and writing these articles and blah, blah, blah. So therefore, I have all this experience that you students need to listen to me. Which kind of goes back to Ferret's notion of rejecting the bank concept of learning, right? That we just dumping information on our students, but that we are active learners. So these three things, and that's what I call it initial conceptual tools, have grounded much of my thinking about teaching and ways in which I try to teach. Obviously, I've been doing it for 20-something years. So over the years, I've developed my own theories and my own twists to these ideas. First of all, I do teach in a way that I feel that our student-centered courses. It is all about the students, about the stories. As a matter of fact, I even tell students day one in class, I do not lecture. So read the material, have questions, be engaged, be prepared to ask questions in class. Otherwise, we're just going to look at each other here. And that doesn't mean, and I reassure the students too, that doesn't mean that I'm not prepared and that I don't take my teaching seriously, but that I rather frame whatever lecture, whatever bigger ideas or whatever histories, philosophies we're going to interconnect in class. I mean, whatever I address in class, I want to connect them to whatever they bring into the class themselves. So that way, I believe a lot in read-response theory, which argues that knowledge, understanding, meaning is created between what we, the readers, bring into the text and what the text says. So that's how we actually create knowledge and create meaning. So I do the same thing with my classes. Like, you bring your stories, we talk together. So two things that I have been developing over the years, and I have written about this. So if you guys want to read more about it, you can send me a link and I can send you the links to the articles. But I've developed this notion of food consciousness, and I have presented it as a theory to study text. And for me, this notion of food consciousness means the short definition for it, for the purpose of this presentation, is a critical awareness of how we dwell in the world through our bodies. Food enters our bodies in one way or another, right? But it's recognizing that we have a meal anywhere we have a meal, whether it's from a McDonald's or homemade or organic, is that when we consume that, we're grounding ourselves in the world. So that's what I mean by food consciousness. Is one of the things that I introduce my students to. And I also introduced them to this other term that I developed. I didn't develop the term. I just gave a term to something that all of us talk about, that we are culinary subjects. We are what we eat. So I came up with this notion of culinary subjectivities. And for me, these are, I refer as identities, narratives of identity that are lived, archived, recognized, and performed through our bodies. So those are the two concepts now that are central to my classes, and I've developed this over the years, over 20 years of teaching. What is central to my teaching is also storytelling. My background is in literature. Obviously, I love stories, but in terms of my students, I'm interested in their stories. I'm not always interested only on the stories that we're reading by a well-known author or a published author. A published story is important, but the non-published story of my students' life is equally important. And the 4 R's that I follow on this principle, I call them the R's to how to approach story work. And those R's are respect, relevance, reciprocity, and responsibility. And this works in a number of ways. Is respect for your own story, for my student's story, for me to respect the story, for them to respect their own story, as well as the respect to other people's stories. Relevance in terms of aspects of my story that are relevant to me, but how they're also relevant to other people. To think about, to share stories not in a egotistical, look how wonderful I am, but I've gone through these processes, I have experienced this, and by sharing it, perhaps you will resonate with it, and there will be relevance for the two of us. So I think of relevance in those kinds of ways. Reciprocity, I think we need to do more reciprocity in our life, in all of our lives. That to recognize that we are social beings. Everything in our life functions through our relationships with others. People do things for us, we do for them. When it comes to food, there's a whole range of people, many people and many systems doing things for us so we can eat. The more aware, the more that we develop this food consciousness, it might potentially even change how we eat because of those responsibilities or reciprocity. Responsibility of issues of ethics. When you write your story, when I tell my students you're writing your personal story, it's not really just about you. You're writing about your family. You're writing about your community. You write it because we're members of this. This is what makes us our story. So the 4 R's for approaching story work is by this Native American writer that I have here, Joanna, which I cannot pronounce her last name either, so I'm not going to. So this is not necessarily my ideas of the 4 R's. I just like this Native American notion of what does it mean to write stories, to tell stories, to cultivate stories. So that's central to my working. So moving on, why it matters? Why does stories matter? This might be kind of what do you call it? What I'm trying to say here, I can't think of words. Might be too, I'm sure you all thought about this, but this is when I'm thinking about why does it matter for me, for students to learn to tell their own stories? And these are the reasons that I give them. With our stories, we claim our place, our home, our dwelling. With our stories, we define our relationship to others, human and non-human. With our stories, we create moments of reflection. With our stories, we reinvent ourselves as well as reimagine the world. With our stories, we navigate the unfamiliar through our own voice. With our stories, we affirm our right to be and to become. Those for me are central to, and I don't necessarily put a PowerPoint thing in my classes when I'm teaching and show them this slide. As a matter of fact, I reflected on this because of this presentation right now. But I think it comes through in my writing. I mean, in my assignments, in the way that I ask them to always integrate your own personal stories to the literature that we're reading. So I think these ideas come through that. Let's see. But if I'm so interested in having students create stories, their own stories, I also feel that then I have a responsibility and reciprocity. They're sharing the stories with me, but they need to go beyond me. The stories need to go beyond an assignment. To me, that's very important. So I have thought very hard about this question and taking the responsibility seriously. That if I'm going to ask my students to take a chance to be vulnerable in some ways by sharing intimate personal stories, what do I do to create spaces that really go beyond just the classroom? How do I take the classroom outside the classroom? And I've done a number of things throughout the 20 years of my career. And that have included by taking the final projects of my students and creating museums, both physical museums, as well as virtual museums using 3D technologies, in which in virtual museums, the audience is really a global audience. I've created an oral story collection on folklore, and many of those stories have food. And it's housed in the Institute of Oral History here at the University of Texas at El Paso. We use, like I said, 3D technologies to create museums, to do all interesting things. We also created, I can never pronounce that word, cinemagraphs. I refer to it as a picture that has something that moves. When I teach literature and film courses. And lately, I actually have developed a podcast called the Paso Food Voices, and some of the hosts of those episodes are my students. So that becomes another venue for sharing their stories and the knowledge. And lately, I've been working with this technique of clusters and vignettes just to get them to write, to get them to trust the creative voice, the creative energy, and then write a vignette. And some of those have actually led to being published blogs in El Paso Food Voices website, which is my latest public-facing project, which I'll share with you in a few minutes. Am I going okay? Am I going too fast? This is good? So students creating, preserving, and sharing the culinary subjectivities through their food stories. That is the key to my teaching food in my courses. This idea of creating, preserving, sharing is also very much influenced by my background as a folklorist. As a folklorist, our pillar as folklorists is to preserve, to gather, so that we don't lose stories, practices, knowledge of the community, to preserve it for future generations, and to share it. Because if we preserve but we're not sharing, then who has access to it, right? So I use the same principles of folklore in my classes. So now I'm going to move forward and show you some examples of how this framing of a pedagogy, integral to the students' stories, has manifested in some projects, okay? So here, just some examples. As you can see, in 2005, we created, this is results from my Mexican American folklore class, which I began to teach in 2003, and I'm still teaching every 3 or 4 semesters. But the image that you see here is just to show you some of the things that we've done. And I'll tell you some of the stories of why these are, to me, important. The Mamás Molcajete, a colleague of mine, Dr. Campbell, said, oh, I'm friends with the director of the archaeology museum here in El Paso. And I said, well, my students, I just did Mexican American folklore, and my students did some amazing stories, taran, taran, taran. Anyway, long story short, we got together, we put together an exhibit that was there for 6 months. And the molcajete, the moral and pestle that you see in there, the image, I want to share that with you specifically because one of my students, for his final, I said, come up with a artifact, something about your folklore, your family folklore, and write a story, write the history. Ask your family questions. If you have a grandmother or grandfather, ask them questions about this folklore practice. And he picked the molcajete because he had seen it in his aunt's or grand aunt's kitchen forever. He had no idea what the molcajete was or why it was there, but he had remember seeing it. So anyway, he started talking to his her aunt, his tia abuela. How do you say that in English? Grandmother, but and grandmother. No. For those of you who speak Spanish, tia abuela. About the molcajete. And in the process, he learned that this one molcajete had been in his family for 5 generations. And he also learned about who was the first person who owned it and why was it passed on? Why was it passed on to women, especially when they got married, and all the gender implications about who cooks and so forth. But also think about it. Think about this material object and the multitude of histories, the stories, familial stories that it has. When you make your salsa in it, if they still use it, that stone, that volcanic stone, it's already embedded with so many stories of this family. The other thing that I thought was fascinating is that because he got so interested in the molcajete, asking all these questions for a class project, his aunt gave it to him. So now a male member of this family has it. He only has one son, and he already said that his son will have this when he gets married. So talk about folklore and traditions, right? It shifted the tradition in terms of gender now, but he continues that story. The other reason why I'm putting it here is because that was the central piece of this museum exhibit. His story was the focus, along with other stories. Moving on, I just put here the symbol of the Institute of Oral History, just because, like I said, we have a project there on El Paso folklore, and many of those stories include food, and they are my students' stories. The other picture that you see here, we're not in Second Life, so you can't see the movement. But I had the opportunity for about 5 years to participate with the Smithsonian Virtual Latino Museum. We had a partnership, and we did a lot of things for the Dia de los Muertos, the Day of the Death. So I was teaching folklore, and I said, well, let's do altars. And a lot of the stories do have to do with food. Just quickly, I had no idea what Second Life was. I had no idea what 3D technology was. I just said, sure, that sounds like fun. Let's do it. So my students and I just jump into it. How we did it, I don't know, but we did. And a fascinating story here is that one of my students in this class, learning to use this technology for the first time, one of the assignments that I gave was to create an avatar that represented part of the folklore. She created this dancer with a candle, very typical Mexican dance because her grandmother used to dance that. Long story short, she actually won a competition that the Smithsonian Latino Virtual Museum had. She got the first prize with the best avatar for the year. So I'm very proud to say that. So once again, bringing the story, in this case, not so much about food, but still bringing the story to a wider audience and being recognized that her story, her voice has value. Next, this is a course I taught on food and literature, film, literature and film, and of course, all my courses in one way or another will deal with food. This is a visual story. So when I talk about students' voice and student stories, I don't always mean written stories. They're visual stories, they're audio stories. There are a multitude of ways of telling a narrative, right, or telling a story, and I try to engage as many of them as I can in my classes to give my students many opportunities to tell their story. So this student who actually was a media, majoring in media studies, what he decided to do is this photograph that has something that moves. And he also created it as a poster. So he did 2 things. And the background of the story is that he remembered that his grandmother, when he was a kid, used to make soda pops with root beer and ice cream. and used to make sopapillas, which is what he's trying to make here with the dough. And he also remembered that his grandmother had this blue apron, checker blue apron. So for the assignment, he wanted to create that memory. He wanted to represent the visual memory of food and his grandmother. And he couldn't find the blue apron. His grandmother has passed away. So his aunt and him went to a fabric store, looked for the fabric. She made an apron for him for this project. And to me, that was very special because it's a way of bringing the family into the project, into the story. So he created this poster, this image. And because of that story, he decided to call it Soda Pop Films Presents, a reference to the soda pop the grandmother made. The Blue Apron, a reference to his grandmother's blue apron. And then the date here in theaters, April 15th, that's his grandmother's birthday. So in this image, with very few text, he brought to life that memory of his grandmother, which is his story. Next, I taught a graduate seminar. I've taught a number of them, but this one was on gastrographies. I just came up with crazy names. Food and memory. And this, once again, is the journal entry from a student from that class. And I'm going to ask Beth if she doesn't mind reading it for us one more time.
When I first looked at the syllabus, I felt scared and uneasy because food studies was unfamiliar to me. Yet once I began reading the memoirs and philosophical articles, I became enthralled and acquired a taste for this type of literature. Reflecting upon the course, I can undoubtedly assert that this class has definitely created many memories. I will forever remember our sharing meals, endless nights attempting to grasp the concept of subjectivity, objectivity, Kant's aesthetics. This class exposed me to the new ideas and forms of thinking. Previous to the semester, I had never paid much attention to food other than in a superficial manner. Now I am more aware of food's critical implications, the reflective capacity of taste, the way in which certain foods make me feel, how food can be seen in terms of time and space, and that we literally are what we eat. Food has slowly become an essential part of my outlook on life. Of course, food is essential as a nutrient, but food, at least for me, is now a way of looking at the world around me and understanding my relationship in it.
Thank you. And to me, this what I'm hoping that you're getting from this little last paragraph from her journal is this notion of food consciousness, where she started in the semester and where she ended, and how the more deeply we do think about food, it does change how we engage with the world. So this is the notion of food consciousness is, how we dwell in the world through our bodies, through that we put in our bodies. So another story, and this one I was going to actually go to the podcast and have you listen to his story, but I'm a little concerned that if we do that, we might get lost coming back in. So is it okay if I just paraphrase? Beth is saying yes. And I invite our audience today just to go to Paso Food Voices and look at episode number 6 so you can hear Josh. But this is also about that in order to understand the impact of food in our lives, we do have to listen to what I refer to as food voice. And this is a concept from Annie. Can you help me with her last name? Nutritionist. She wrote about food voice. Anyway, sorry about not having my references.
Annie Hawk Lawson.
Thank you. She a few years back, a lot of years back actually, wrote a whole thing on food voice. So I used her article. I also have sort of kind of added a little more to what I think the food voice means. But what I wanted to show here, I'm just going to paraphrase it, like I said, so I don't want to lose time getting out of the presentation. Josh took my class in 2016, and when we're talking about narratives and food, he shared a story about coming out to his mom and being in the kitchen, and he says in the story, when I told my mom I'm gay, nothing happened. Mom didn't say anything. It was total silence. And he said, I didn't want to look up because I was afraid, so on and so forth. And then he starts describing that he heard a noise. Her mom started getting pans and pots. and then he heard the pouring of the milk, and then he heard the chocolate, the smelling of the chocolate melting, and he knew that she was making chocolate abuelita. He she puts once it's made, she puts a mug of chocolate in front of him and tells him, don't stay up too late," and leaves, and that's it. 5 years later, they're at the cemetery. He did not meet his grandmother. He had passed away when he was very little, and he asked, "Did mom, tell me stories about grandmother?" And his mom says, "Well, your grandmother never told us that she loved us. She never said anything like that. But when she made things like chocolate abuelita or atole or those kind of drinks, that's when I knew that she loved us." And at that point, what I'm arguing in my work is that, and what I'm trying to share here is that at that moment is when Josh Lopez was able to hear food voice. He understood what the gesture of food meant. And by the way, he used that story that he did in this class for his essay when he applied for a PhD in University of North Texas to study food, and he's about to get his PhD already. So once again, I think that shows the power of learning to trust, to listen to trust, to write, to share your story. I want to quickly move on to the latest thing that I've done, which is this idea of clusters and vignettes. In a class that I just taught last year, introduction to literary studies, students come into the class. At this point, they know that they're going to talk about that. If you take a class with me, food is going to be central. I think after 20 years of being here, students have figured that out already, and so has my colleagues. So anyway, what I did in this class, I experimented a little bit. I used the cluster, the nucleus of food is 3 times in the semester. Day 1, in the middle of the semester, and at the end of the semester. And the way that it works is that I give them the nucleus, in this case fluid is, and I give them 2 minutes to write a cluster. Whatever comes to their mind, they just do this arrows and circles. Don't think about it, just do it really quickly. Of course, the idea here is to try to use the right side of our brain, right? That just goes. And then I give them 3 minutes to do a vignette based, influenced by whatever the cluster was. So this one is from one student. As we read it, just be gentle. If we don't understand everything that it says, and just remind yourself that she did this in 3 minutes. Beth, do you mind reading it?
I'm not sure how you want me to read it.
Not the cluster, just the vignette.
Storage of emotions ends up leaving me empty, hungry for more. The food of life encourages a path that is meaningful. I finally am filled up with food and knowledge. The power is limited. In the end, I'm starving for feeling that brings me health.
So, like I said, I'm not sure how exactly to analyze this, but I think there's some I think each sentence that says something very profound in how she's beginning to think about food, not just to eat and sustain our bodies, but food to sustain our spirit, to sustain life in general, and how complicated that relationship. I mean, I see a lot of that already in day 1 of this introduction. I want to share another one. This is in the middle of the semester. So this is what a student wrote when I asked again, food is, after 6 weeks of talking about food and theories about food. Do you mind, Beth?
Not at all. Again, I'm honored. Food is, what is food? At the middle of January, I was sure I had an idea. Now I don't. I can tell you what I consume, and yes, it is food, but it is so much more. There are people behind my meal, be it homemade or from Wendy's. There is an ecosystem being decimated. There are stories I don't know of all them led to this plate on my table. There is culture in my food. There are the traditions my grandma followed that are not the tradition yours does.
So what I appreciate about this is that, and I hope you can see it, that after 6 weeks, she's beginning to understand that food is kind of complicated, and that there's a network of relationships that come into what we eat, whether it's from fast food to slow food to tradition to ecosystems that get destroyed because of how we eat. So obviously the complexity of food and how it's related to her because she ends up with her grandmother. It's part of that story that I'm trying to cultivate in terms of the food consciousness and pulling out from my students. You're bringing so much into the classroom. I'm just giving you some extra information. You add it to your life. You tell your story. this is the same cluster for the last semester from two different students. Do you mind reading them both, Beth?
Okay. Food is my voice, my philosophy, and a practice I put into place every day veganism to reduce animal exploitation and suffering. I have a voice to choose my meals savory, sweet, umami, tastiest without a face. The mundane task of eating can be disregarded and tossed away with all other simplicities of life. But if we were to stop for a second and listen and feel our food, we would notice its life, its vibrancy, its importance. Food is everything and everyone. Food is alive and dead and everything in between. Sometimes, most times, food should be respected as more than survival.
So I don't know about you, but I every time I read this, I get really, really humble, feel humble actually, to see that students from where they began to, because early on most of them were talking about food, well, is tradition, is my mom, is so they had it in that context. But I think in these two vignettes, the one in the middle of the semester and this at the end, I think we all can see that they really have thought more deeply of the complexity of something that we all totally engage, that they have a story, and that story is connected to much larger, complicated social, political, economic, environmental issues. Um, so that's, I mean, I don't know. Let's just leave it at that, and then we'll ask questions in a minute. Um, the some of these vignettes, and once again, I'm not going to do it this time because I'm worried that if I get out of here to show you the blogs, we're going to lose the connection. But two of the students, or three, wrote such powerful last reflection in the class, as an essay or a poem that they submitted for publication to El Paso Food Orchard. This is the latest project that I'm working on, my latest project, public facing scholarship, I guess. And it has a link in it that is called Epicureans blog. So people can submit reflections about food. It does go through a peer review, and then if it's accepted, it gets published. So I have two publications here for my students. So that's another way in which I'm trying to create spaces, like I said earlier on, to so the students' voice and story gets out there in the world, so that they can also see. If my students have learned to think that when something's printed or in a digital format, it has legitimacy. Well, this is another way for me to say, so does your story. Okay. Now, the last thing that I want to share real quickly, and then we stop there, is that I've been listening to audiobooks. I just totally got into audiobooks just because when I'm driving or doing something, I can listen to more stories, right? So I was in San Francisco last week, 2 weeks ago, I don't remember, for a conference, and I'm listening to this story, a memoir, written by somebody from El Paso. Um, it's called Andale Prieta, and I'm almost at the end of the book, and then I hear something at the end of chapter 33 and at the beginning of chapter 34, and I think this proves, not proves, that's not the right word, this affirms what I'm trying to do with my pedagogy approach, and this idea that your voice, your story, is a form of justice. So I'm going to share that with you. This is the book. It's called Andale Prieta by Jasmine Ramirez. And here I have two quotes, how chapter 33 ends and how chapter 34 begins. And I'm going to ask Beth to read those two quotes for us.
Okay. I had not been in school in 5 years, and now I was in graduate class full of students all saying things I didn't understand. I felt like an imposter. Reading food theory dumbfounded me. The professor, Dr. Meredith Abarca, spoke so passionately about food, my cheeks flushed. I was so often muted in class for fear of saying something silly. I kept my head down until Dr. Abarca called on me one day. What do you think? I glanced up. Yes, you. What do you think? I looked up and opened my mouth. That food and culture class was the start of a new chapter for me. Little did I knew that a few years later, I would be cooking a meal with my boyfriend for my family. I looked forward to asking them more questions about grandmother Ita and help fill in the holes in all the pieces I was writing. I was also really looking forward to feeding them. Dr. Abarca's class had renewed my love for food and cooking. I bask in the memories of cooking with Ita. Or
So
is it Etta? Or Etta?
Ita. So this
Ita.
memoir is really the story of her grandmother. She's just capturing her grandmother's life. Um, um, and when she says, I look forward to asking my family for more stories about my grandmother to fill the gap, she's talking about the gaps of the story that she's writing, this memoir. Like I said, I was driving in San Francisco to a conference, and all of a sudden I get to the end of chapter 13, and all of a sudden this is a mention to my class. Um, and I really appreciate the way that the story just ends, right? I open my mouth, and then the next thing is how food, remembering the power of food, and not so much because of my class. I mean, the thing that she says and how she quotes us about talking about theory about food is really funny. It first made me laugh a lot. Um, how silly we can sound sometimes to try to sound so sophisticated about food. But the point that I'm really getting at is that it rekindled, it connected her to something powerful about her relationship with her grandmother through food. It affirmed that food is extremely transformative and powerful in our lives, which as a food scholar, that's what I'm really trying to tell all my students. And it's a story that they have. I want to stop here because I'm aware of time. We only have about 15 minutes left or so. And I would sort of like to just sort of kind of take questions, reactions, response, things that I can do better. Anyway, I just want to open up for discussion to our audience, with our audience.
Okay. And so folks, I think you can do two things. You can post in the chat or in the Q&A, or I think I might be also able to unmute you if you want to also speak. And so if you want to raise your hand to ask a question. Well, perhaps you're thinking or typing. I'll kick things off. Meredith, first, thank you so much. You make me incredibly jealous that I don't get to be one of your students in the classroom. So I feel like I get a little glimpse of that here. And I'm so appreciative. When you're working towards maybe publishing or having something public facing, especially with undergrads, how do you deal with the editing process, right? So, I mean, there's that understanding of sort of maybe proper, English, but then there's the student's voice, and sometimes those don't align perfectly. So, how do you handle that?
What I have published so far, first of all, I do have I tell the students that and that do have. Well, I don't tell them. We do have a peer review. So that the story does connect to, because this is specifically called a Paso Food Voices, right? So it's something that connects to a Paso. So we always look for that connection. So that's what the main thing. The second one is, as long as the grammar, I mean, like there's not tons of misspellings, are there. It's not there as long as the grammar is proper, correct. If they shift into Spanish or Spanglish, if they italicize words in Spanish, or if they don't, I don't change that. I kind of want our Paso Food Voices to really be a place in which their story and their voice can be reflected. As long as 3 or 4 of us who read this before it gets published understand the message, then to me that's good, because I don't want to confine them to one kind of writing, if that makes sense. That would kind of, I think, undermine the principle of what I'm trying to say about your voice, your story.
Great, thank you. I think it's Divana. I made it so you can unmute yourself and ask.
Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Doctora Abarca, for your presentation. I just was on a panel with you in San Francisco, and I'm so excited to hear your presentation. Thank you again for that. One thing I was thinking about, and I really appreciate also just the specific examples of the assignments. Like I loved the cluster and vignette. I thought that's so creative. And then to do it throughout the semester, such like a great kind of evaluation and reflective thing for them to kind of consider. So thank you so much. Okay, so my question is what your experience is like working with other disciplines on campus or engaging with other, like I'm thinking of, or in the area in El Paso, the ag school at NMSU, like how you kind of like outside of literary, outside of food studies, but that still has relevance and bearing on students getting a maybe critical understanding, especially when they're delving into their food stories, of that kind of connection, like you mentioned, political, economic, while still, you know, it's an English class, a literary class. But I'm just curious your experience over the years of teaching these kinds of classes, of how you've engaged with, yeah, different disciplines and maybe different, like I'm thinking here, like nutrition programs or ag, like very different kind of disciplines and ways of looking at food, but it's relevant. And yeah, if that's come up for you, how you've thought about that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have not actively gone and connect. I mean, in my research, I have to some degrees. Spoke to professors in other disciplines, nutrition, anthropology, a number of different ways in which I have collaborated either roundtables like we did last week in Knox. For this particular presentation and what I'm talking about here, it's really sort of focused on the classes that I'm personally teaching. So all of these examples, all of this has to do with students who 90% of them are literature majors, because I work in the English department. When I teach in undergrads, sometimes some of them are not all English majors because they take this as an elective. So I haven't had that opportunity to work with other students in that respect.
Thank you. That makes sense. I appreciate it.
I have a couple of questions in the Q&A. First, from somebody logged in as graduate assistant. Thank you so much for sharing. This was lovely. I'm curious, how do you prepare for a session of class in the student-centric critical pedagogy form that you do? What is the essential preparation that you do in order for a session to be successful in your eyes?
Okay, I don't. How's that for an answer? I don't really prepare. No, I meant, and I mean what I said, that I don't lecture. So I don't spend any time trying to figure out, okay, I'm reading this novel, this is the passage that we're going to read, this is the article, and this is what I'm going to concentrate. I have a general idea, obviously, of the central themes that I want to get out. To me, the one way, the classroom begin has been wonderful exercise, because, for instance, I can give them a concept of you know, a particular concept that we're reading about, you know, fast food, ecosystem, whatever word we might be working on, and I can give it to them as the nucleus for the cluster. And this has worked wonderful because it gives them a few minutes to reflect on the idea without calling on them and making them nervous about, I don't know what to say, I don't know what's wrong. The other thing that I do is that I do reinforce that I do not believe in objectivity. All knowledge is subjective. And by reinforcing that over and over is my way of encouraging the students to take chances and say things. I think the most successful classes are the ones that take me for a loop. Meaning, when a student asks a question that I had not even thought about it at all, it's like, oh wow, that's great. Let's think about it together. Let's go back to it together. Let's tease it out together. Let's figure it out together. I don't know if it's just my personality or the fact that I've been doing this for too many years or what. I have absolutely no problem telling the students, I don't know. Because I don't know. So to me, I think those moments of complete honesty in which we collectively try to figure something out are the most accessible. And I also think the other point is to be willing to walk in the class and lose control of it. Meaning, I took many classes as a student, obviously, in which it was very clear that the professor wanted to be in charge. You need to be comfortable, kind of go with the flow of the class. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I can answer. I can answer it.
Great. Summer, I've also unmuted. If you want to unmute, you can ask your question. Summer, I see you have your hand up, and I've clicked it so you can unmute yourself.
It says that it won't let her unmute.
She should be able to. Well, if in the meantime, we do have another question. Jessica asks, How do you address students who do not feel comfortable writing about or discussing personal experiences from their lives or sharing their personal stories with others due to past trauma, etc.? I sometimes encounter this in my food memoir and personal essay courses, and I'm always looking for more ideas.
The first thing, it has happened to me too. The first thing is that I always say, remember that minimally I will be reading it. So write something that you are okay with my reading it, and if the student is okay with my reading it but nobody else, then it never gets in any kind of the public spaces that I have for the class. The other one is that because I do teach literature, and I suppose we can do this with any other class, I don't think that this pedagogy of your voice, your story, your justice, it will work, truly will work, if I force students to do something they're uncomfortable. So there's always the option to write in reflection to something that we're reading instead. I also tell them the memoirs are crafted, meaning if I'm going to tell you my story, I'm going to craft how I'm going to tell you my story. I'm not going to open up my guts and tell you just absolutely everything horrible about my life, or we craft our narratives. We invent ourselves through our stories. And that doesn't mean that you're lying. It's just that you are reflecting how you want to present yourself, and that's perfectly fine. There's healing in that way of how we reflect ourselves. So I'm a firm believer that not everything in our lives is game for public discourse. Some things are in fact private, and we keep them private, and we respect that. That goes to the notion of reciprocity, responsibility. It's to recognize the limits. I had to respect the limits, and students need to know that I respect those limits.
Thank you. And there, I think you can see the claps and the hearts flooding the screen. Summer, do you want to try again by hitting the mic icon? It's locked for some reason. Okay, just ask some Q&A. Sorry about that, Summer. Would have loved to have heard your voice. She says, or they say, or he says, I'm curious what your thoughts are on your STEM colleagues' framing. I'm a plant biology PhD student, frame crop production objectivity. I struggle with the lack of food voice stories in conversations about food production.
Okay, my apologies here because I'm not sure I understand the question.
I'm wondering if they're asking how you said you don't believe in objectivity, but
Okay.
but perhaps scholars in biology do talk about crop production in a way that they would say is objective, and how do you react or live next to that very different understanding of knowledge, and how can you get more stories perhaps or food voice right from that, that tension of objective subjective when you're talking about food production.
Okay, let me frame what I mean by I don't believe in when I tell students I don't believe in objectivity. I believe in narratives, and I think that there are facts. So that doesn't mean that I don't believe in facts. They are biological facts. They are historical facts. They are climate facts. They are environmental facts. I'm not a denier that I'm not saying that there are no facts. What I'm saying is that facts are communicated through a story. And because it is a story, because it's a narrative, we need to be always fully aware that a certain perspective is framing the narrative. So when I'm saying that I don't believe in blind objectivity is that the facts, biological facts, environmental facts, historical facts, are always transmitted to us through a form of narrative. Scientists in the STEM fields, they tell a story about a finding. They tell a story about production. what I'm, as a literary critic who pays a lot of attention to word choices, to construction of sentences to communicate. What I'm telling my students, what I'm trying to help them develop their skills, their critical skills, is recognize that it is a narrative. That doesn't mean that it's a raw narrative. It's just a narrative, and that there are a multitude of different kinds of narratives. The same facts can be understood differently if the narrative in which it's communicated shifts. So I don't know if that explains what I mean by this blunt statement that I said about I don't believe in objectivity. There's a difference between that and not believing in actual facts. It's just that they get communicated through narrative.
So Summer followed up, and I still think you addressed this though. They say, I'm thinking of things like GMO crop production being addressed uncritically by bio/STEM folks, where there's almost a hierarchy where STEM villainizes folks fighting for food justice, like pushing back against Monsanto and seen as, quote, anti-science. But I think you
I think
in a
I
way
answered by saying that even those folks who have that strong narrative, it's a strong narrative. It is a narrative. And that's what I, as a person that fundamentally deals with stories, that's my background. It's happened to be stories about food, but in my background, what I believe in strongly is in story, in the power of story, but also to understand that there are multiple stories to one fact.
And what a wonderful way to end it. I'm afraid I have to go because I have another meeting to get to for ASFS. But again, I'd like to thank Dr. Meredith Abarca for giving us what a wonderful way to wrap up this seminar series. 3 different perspectives, all really wonderful, thinking about pedagogy, food, justice, inclusivity, and especially thinking about the students. So thank you so much for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you in real time at a conference and reading more of your work.
Pretty soon. We'll be in Syracuse. Thank you. I just want to say real quickly, thank you to you, to everybody who organized this. And most importantly, equally importantly, thank you to all of you who are here. I only see numbers of people that show up. I appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I know we're all busy. If there's anything I can help do, if you want to see more of the works that I do, get copies of my syllabus, I'm just an email away. Okay. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.